The snow hadn't fallen yet, but the sky already hung heavy with silence, the kind of silence that feels like watching eyes. At the edge of the wilderness, beneath a crooked pine whose roots clawed out from red dust, she dropped to her knees. Her dress was torn, soaked through with river water and sweat. No one knew she was here. No one knew the baby was coming. And there would be no midwife, no warm blankets, no whispering hand to guide her through the storm building in her body. They'd cast her out from the settlement 3 weeks ago, after the preacher's wife accused her of sin. No trial, no mercy, only a sack of dry beans and a cracked canteen tossed at her feet. She'd begged them not to turn her away, not with winter approaching, and not with a child stirring inside her. But redemption never came when asked for. Out here, it would have to be earned or bled for. She dug her fingers into the earth as pain clawed through her spine. The contractions were coming faster now, like distant thunder rolling into quick. Her vision swam. She bit down on her own arm to muffle the scream. No one must hear her, not the wolves, not the wind, not the memory of the man who'd left her with this child and a promise he never meant to keep. Blood stained the ground beneath her, and the cries of her newborn pierced the silence just as the first flake of snow drifted down. She wrapped the child in her shawl, trembling, her body spent, her lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. She looked at the baby, a girl, tiny and perfect despite the violence of the world. She should have wept with joy, but all she felt was terror, because now they were two, alone in the wild, and the sun was already sinking. Her limbs refused to lift her. She curled around the baby, whispering breath against her tiny head. She didn't pray. She'd already tried that. The wind picked up, trees moaned in the distance. She was ready to sleep, maybe for good, when a sound broke the hush. Hoofbeats, slow, deliberate. A horse, not a wild one, but ridden. Then a shadow fell over her body like a soft eclipse. She blinked through frost and fear. A man dismounted. His coat was trimmed with silver buttons, and his boots bore the dust of long roads. Hair dark as raven wings spilled over his shoulders, and his face was carved like old sandstone, strong, regal, unshaken by the cold. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He knelt, lifting her into arms that smelled of cedar and leather and smoke. She faded into unconsciousness, clutching her child close, unaware she had just been carried into the heart of something ancient, and just something called frontier redemption. She woke to warmth, something her body had forgotten how to feel. The scent of burning juniper filled her lungs, soft and earthy. A low fire crackled nearby. Her back rested against woven blankets thick with years of use, and her child, still alive, still breathing, lay cradled against her chest in a deerskin wrap. For a moment, she thought she'd died, and this was the quiet edge of some better world. But the ache in her hips, the bruises along her ribs, and the sharp reminder of hunger pulling at her belly all told her she was still among the living. The place was unfamiliar, a round hut of timber and packed clay, smoke curling from a vent. In the center above, animal hides covered the floor. Dried herbs hung from beams above like forgotten prayers. Her clothes had been cleaned, her wounds dressed, and her baby no longer cried, just stared with wide, blinking eyes at a world that had already taken too much from her mother. The door creaked open. The man stepped in without sound, snow dusting his shoulders. He set down a small satchel of roots and flint, then poured warm broth into a carved wooden bowl and placed it beside her. Still, he said nothing. She didn't ask. Something about his silence felt kinder than words. Outside, the storm had arrived in full. Snow thickened the world into a white hush. Wind howled, but it could not reach this space. And yet the woman did not feel safe. Gratitude and fear warred inside her. She had learned that kindness often carried debts she could not pay, and that men, no matter how regal or gentle, were capable of leaving deeper wounds than the wilderness. For days, he came and went like a ghost in the pines. He brought firewood, food, and fresh water. When her child grew restless, he crushed dried roots into a warm sob and rubbed it gently over the baby's belly, easing the pain. He gave her space, but not absence, a quiet presence that never demanded, only offered. Still, she dared not ask his name. To name someone was to make them real, and she'd lost too much to risk making anything real again. But slowly, something within her shifted. The wild that had nearly killed her was now the place her child had first breathed. The hut that once felt foreign now smelled of safety. The silence between her and the man grew heavier, but not colder. She began to watch him not with suspicion, but with recognition. His hands moved with purpose, each motion deliberate. When he carved into elk bone near the fire, he did so with reverence. When he walked the ridge at dawn, he moved like someone who belonged to the land, not above it. One night, as the snow fell in silver sheets and her baby slept, she caught him standing just outside the doorway, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something older than time. She studied him then, truly, not as a man, but as a protector, a quiet force who had not asked why she was alone, who she'd angered, or what she had lost. She realized he had seen women like her before thrown away, broken by judgment, chewed up by the settlements that preached mercy but practiced exile. And yet he had carried her from the edge of death into warmth, without ever asking her to explain her sins. In that moment, she did something she hadn't done since her mother's grave was lowered into dust. She whispered a name not his, but hers, soft, unsure, but he heard it. And when he turned, his nod was not pity. It was respect. Frontier redemption had begun not when she was saved, but when someone saw her as more than the story others wrote in shame. And though neither of them spoke it aloud, something sacred had been set in motion, something that no storm could bury beneath snow. The snow deepened, blanketing the land in silence thick enough to erase memory. Time unraveled differently now. Days passed without names, marked only by the cycle of firewood and the baby's soft cries. Her body mended slowly, but her spirit resisted. She had survived childbirth. Yes, but survival is not the same as living. Something inside her still curled in on itself, unsure whether the warmth she'd been given was real or temporary. After all, nothing good ever lasted. She watched the man from the edge of her blankets, noting the way he greeted the dawn. He spoke to the land as though it answered. When he hunted, he left offerings. When he returned, he carried not only meat, but stories, even if he never told them aloud. His silence was not cold. It was full, the kind that held history. And though he never looked at her with ownership or expectation, she felt a gravity to him, like standing near an ancient tree that had outlived storms. One evening, she ventured outside for the first time, wrapping herself and her child in furs. The snow had stopped. In its place, the air shimmered with frost. Pine needles whispered beneath her boots, and moonlight caught the curve of mountains to the west. The man stood near the fire pit he'd built from Black River stones, feeding small twigs into flame. She watched him a while before sitting opposite, keeping the child nestled against her chest. No words passed, only breath, fire, and stars above. He handed her a carved pendant, smooth bone etched with a symbol she didn't know. She stared at it, unsure whether to accept. But something in her bones told her this wasn't a gift with strings. It was something older than favor. She took it and held it to her heart. In that small motion, she felt something begin to crack open inside her. Winter pressed on. Snow turned to wind. Ice clawed at the corners of the shelter. But inside, the space grew softer. The baby, now weeks old, opened her eyes wider, as if seeing not just the world, but her place in it. Her fingers wrapped around the man's thumb once, and the woman held her breath. He didn't pull away. He smiled, not a full one, but the kind that blooms slow and honest. Then one night, the storm howled louder than any before. The wind threatened. to tear apart even the trees. The fire sputtered and died. The baby cried without comfort. The woman clutched her daughter, panic rising in her throat. But the man moved with quiet urgency, blocking every draft, reinforcing every wall with packed hides and firm timber. He stayed near them through the worst of it, his body between them and the cold. And when the blizzard finally passed, the world beyond was unrecognizable, buried deep. White and wild, they emerged days later to a landscape washed clean. The valley glistened like a frozen sea. The man pointed to the horizon where smoke rose from distant chimney settlements she once called home. Her chest tightened. Memories returned with icy edges, judgmental eyes, bitter sermons, the slap of a church door closing behind her. She turned away from the smoke. But the man did not. His gaze lingered there not in longing, but in understanding. He knew the pain of exile. His people had been forced from land, from language, from memory. Yet here he stood, not in bitterness, but in quiet defiance. His strength was not in retaliation, but in rebuilding. That night, as she held her daughter close, she realized something profound. She was no longer a victim of her past. She had stepped beyond survival. She had stepped into a story not written by fear but by choice. She still didn't know his name, but she had come to believe that perhaps he was not sent to rescue her. Perhaps he was simply there so she could remember how to rescue herself. And in the stillness between them, by firelight and stars, frontier, redemption continued not with loud declarations, but with the slow, sacred work of healing. Spring crept in without announcement. It didn't roar or burst, it whispered. First, the snow softened into trickling creeks. Then the earth cracked open to let the green push through. She watched it all unfold from the doorway of the hut. The baby now strong enough to grip her finger and coo at birdsong. The land thawed, just as her body had, and her soul, long frozen in fear, began to stretch like roots testing warm soil. The man had left at sunrise days ago with only his bow, a pouch of dried meat, and a silent nod. He hadn't said when or if he'd return, yet she hadn't panicked. That surprised her, because fear used to be her closest companion. But now, as she lit the fire herself and fetched water with her daughter tied to her back, she realized she wasn't waiting to be rescued anymore. She was learning to live. On the third day, he returned, but he wasn't alone. 2 riders came behind him, both elders, cloaked in furs and silence. Their faces bore the map of yours, eyes sharp as obsidian. She stiffened when they approached. The shelter, clutching her baby tighter, her mind flooded with past mistakes, punishments, and the belief that strangers always meant judgment. But these strangers didn't look at her like the townspeople once had. They didn't stare through her. They saw her. The woman dismounted first. Her hair was streaked white and bound in braids that smelled of sage and smoke. She touched the baby's cheek with fingers calloused but kind, and then met the mother's eyes with something wordless approval, maybe even recognition. The older man simply nodded once and placed a bundle of wrapped herbs at her feet. It was not a gesture of charity. It was an offering of welcome. Later that night, after they left, she turned to the man as they sat near the fire. For the first time, she truly looked at him not with hesitation, but clarity. This wasn't just a wanderer or a rescuer. He was someone. The way the elders treated him, the way they stood slightly behind him when they spoke, it was in their posture, in the reverence. He wasn't just part of a tribe. He was born of its heartbeat. The truth came to her slowly. He was a prince, not in the way of gold crowns or palaces, but of lineage, of duty. The blood in his veins traced back to those who had once led warriors across canyons and prayed to stars for survival. He didn't flaunt it. He wore it in the way he walked, in how he honored silence, in how he treated land and life with the same weight. She held the baby close, staring at the pendant he'd given her weeks before. The bone carving glinted in the firelight. Its symbol, now understood, It was a mark of protection, of belonging. He had given it to her before she knew what he was, before she knew what she could become. The next morning, they walked the ridge together. No words passed. None were needed. Below, the world stretched wide and open valleys, rivers, forests reborn in color after a season of white silence. It was all still wild. Yes, but no longer frightening. She realized then that fear had once been her only map. But now, she had a new compass, choice. Her child would not grow up behind walls that preached shame. She would know the trees. She would know names older than English. She would walk barefoot on land that remembered its stories. And maybe, just maybe, she would never have to unlearn the lie that she was unworthy. The woman turned to the man beside her. She still didn't speak, but her heart did, and deep within that silent place between them, frontier redemption pulsed like the river thawing from ice, inevitable, quiet, and full of life. The thaw revealed things the snow had hidden not. Just roots and rocks, but remnants of past lives. Broken wagons, abandoned tools, graves marked with faded wood and stone. As the woman walked the edge of the valley with her baby tied close, she found herself drawn to these relics. She had once thought exile was the end. Now she saw it was only the beginning. Loss had not buried her. It had unspooled her. And somewhere in that unraveling, she had found the thread of herself again. The man prince, protector, quiet force watched her without hovering. He gave her tools, not orders, flint, rope, seeds. He taught by doing, and she, once made to feel small by sermons and stares, now stood upright with a baby on her hip and firelight in her eyes. The land did not ask her to be perfect. It only asked her to be present. One morning, they began rebuilding the hut, not because it was crumbling, but because something new needed to rise. The old structure had been a shelter from death. This one would be a place for life. The work was slow and honest. Cedar logs hauled from the ravine. River clay pounded into walls. She learned to shape stone with her bare hands. Her daughter giggled at falling feathers and the chirp of ground squirrels, oblivious to the weight her mother carried. One evening, while smoothing packed mud along a fresh wall, she felt a strange stillness. Not fear, but something deep. A shift in the air. She turned and saw riders far below, at the edge of the forest. They weren't from the man's tribe. Their clothes bore the stiffness of settlers. Hats to clean, guns to visible. A preacher's wagon among them. Her breath caught. She recognized one of the faces. He had called her a disgrace, a stain. He had turned the town against her the moment she showed signs of pregnancy. And now, he was here with others riding toward the ridge she called home. She didn't panic. She simply walked into the hut, placed her child in the cradle the man had carved, and reached for the flint spear he'd taught her to use. But the man stood at the door before she did. He met her gaze, eyes steady, not commanding, but promising. "You are not alone anymore." That's what his silence said, and it was enough. The settlers came not to attack, but to reclaim, or so they said. The preacher spoke of forgiveness, of second chances, but his eyes betrayed the truth. He came to save his reputation, not her soul. He had learned of her survival whispers through traders, glimpses of her beyond the hills, and now he sought to rewrite her story, make her return in shame, bow. Her head proved that the exile had been correction, not cruelty. She stood tall beside the prince. She did not flinch. She did not follow. And when they left, muttering about witches and wildness, she didn't look back. That night, she sang for the first time in years, a lullaby she barely remembered. Her daughter's tiny hand clutched her necklace, the pendant once carved from elk bone, now smoothed by time and touch. She watched the baby's chest rise and fall, and then turned to the man by the fire. The new hut stood behind them, strong, unfinished, but honest, like her. And she knew then, redemption had never waited in the towns. It had lived here, in the marrow of mountains, in the cracks of her own strength, in the hands that built, not broke. Frontier redemption wasn't something given Dot, it was something claimed Dot, and she had claimed it without apology. Summer brought more than warmth, it brought memory. The rivers ran fuller now, and the earth beneath her toes had shed its frostbitten hush. Wildflowers sprang up between the cracks of the stones they laid, stubborn in their color, refusing to be unnoticed. Like her, once hidden in shame, she now stood beneath the open sky and dared to be seen. She had learned to read the land not in books, but in silence. The rustle of leaves told her where the deer passed. The cries of hawks warned of snakes. Her daughter, now growing fast and fearless, toddled near the stream and called out to birds in her own wild tongue. The Navajo prince watched them with the gaze of someone who did not claim ownership, but kinship. He did not say he loved them. He did not need to. Every action was a vow. The hut became a home. They painted symbols along the beams, not to keep things out, but to honor what had already entered: forgiveness, strength, and truth. Every stone in the fire pit had a story. Every feather hanging from the doorway was found, not bought. They had nothing fine, but everything here was sacred. One afternoon, while gathering berries with her daughter, she came across the grave of a woman buried long ago. A wooden cross stood crooked over it, half swallowed by moss. She paused, whispering a silent promise, not just to the dead, but to herself. I will not vanish like you. I will not be forgotten. The land had erased many, but it would remember her because she would leave behind more than bones. The prince had begun carving something in secret. At first, she thought it was another cradle or tool. But one morning, as sunlight poured across the glade, he brought it to her. It was a staftal, smooth, etched with the symbols of rebirth and flight. A hawk in midair, a woman's open hand, and near the top, their daughter's tiny palm print pressed into the wood. He placed it upright near the doorway, a mark, a declaration. This home was not hidden. It was claimed. Days passed in golden rhythm. She no longer feared what might come, but she remained watchful, because peace, like fire, needed tending. One evening, while gathering herbs beyond the ridge, she heard the sound of hooves again, but it was not the stiff gait of settlers. This was different, louder, heavier. A rider galloped alone, dust rising behind him. He wore a red sash across his chest, symbol of warning. She stepped forward as the prince emerged from the trees, meeting the rider halfway. A threat stirred in the east, not from settlers this time, but from rival men-claimed jumpers, land thieves. Men who saw the wilderness not as sacred, but as ripe for possession. They had seen smoke rising from their hearth, word spreading that a woman and child lived freely on untouched land. And men like them didn't believe in peace that wasn't owned. The prince turned back with clenched fists. The message was clear. They would come. She did not cry. She did not beg. She looked at her daughter sleeping on a bed of woven reeds and thought only one thing. I will not run. This time, she would stand. Not for herself alone, but for every woman cast out and called unworthy. For every child born beyond town walls. For every soul who dared to live without permission. She placed her hand on the staff by the door. If the world wanted to test her again, it would learn this truth. She no longer feared exile. Because she had already found frontier redemption land, she would protect it, no matter the storm. They came at dawn for riders, their coats dusty, mouths curled into sneers as if they had already won. They weren't from any tribe, nor from the town. They were the kind of men who saw land as a thing to take, women as things to break, and silence as weakness. They didn't expect resistance. They expected a woman with a baby to cower. They expected a quiet man to stand aside. What they met instead was a fire already lit, not just in the hearth, but in the eyes of those waiting for them. She stood barefoot in the doorway, hair braided and marked with charcoal across her cheeks. not to scare but to remind. She was of the land now, not a guest, not a trespasser. This place had claimed her the moment she bled into its earth, and rose again with her daughter wrapped to her chest. The prince stepped forward first. He said nothing, offered no threats, just stood tall, hand resting on the carved staff now planted deep beside the fire pit. Behind him, others emerged from the tree-lined men and women of his people, quiet and still as the pines, but no less sharp than flint. Word had traveled, not through newspapers or laws, but through stories whispered over fires, through the weight of ancestors who still walked in dreams. The intruders scoffed at first, called them ghosts, called her names she'd long shed like old skin. But when they stepped closer, one with a rifle slack at his side, what met them wasn't fear. It was a woman who had survived death alone. It was a mother who'd learned to wield silence like armored. It was a man born of kings, not crowned in gold, but in earth and spirit. It was a child watching it all, wrapped in a shawl of feathers and calm. The standoff didn't last long. The men left angry, but unbloodied. Perhaps it was the stillness in the air, or the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. Perhaps it was the eyes watching from branches. Or perhaps some part of them knew deep down that they weren't just outnumbered. They were outlived. Afterward, no celebration followed, just work. Stones stacked higher, fences woven with vines, seeds buried with care. The land asked nothing but respect, and they gave it. Seasons passed. Her daughter grew taller, surer. She learned to walk the trails her mother once crawled in pain. She sang to the trees. She carried water with pride. She placed new symbols on the door with her own hands. The woman no longer flinched when she heard hoofbeats. She no longer dreamt of fire or exile. She dreamt of roots, of sky, of mornings spent watching her child chase sunlight through grass. The prince remained beside them, never over them, a steady presence. He built without needing thanks. He watched without control. In his silence, she had found the space to become whole. One night, as the stars bloomed wide above their hut, she sat with her daughter on her lap and looked at the carved staff still planted firm by the door. Wind passed through the valley like a gentle breath. The world had not changed, but she had. She once begged for mercy. Now she taught strength. She once clung to shame. Now she carried story. She once walked alone into the wild to give birth and expected to die. Instead, she had lived, not by being saved, but by rising, not by returning to what cast her out, but by claiming a land that asked only truth. And as the child on her lap reached up to touch the moonlight, with wide, unafraid fingers, the woman finally understood frontier. Redemption was not a place. It was a choice, a beginning born from the end. And it would live in her blood for generations to come.